A little of the law. Now, they did away with the Sabbath because Satan hated the Sabbath because, you know, if that's a sign between you and Yahweh that you belong to them. So Yahweh allowed the Sabbath to be taken away from them. But he had it available for those who wanted to come to him. If a person had to, without a priest, had to go back and start studying and find 613 laws to go by, they would have never been anyone saved or come out of that situation. And that's what Yahweh turned it over to. And if you could think of what we're doing right now, without television, without a means to do so, we could never reach anyone, and the world would never hear of us. They didn't have any broadcasting at that time, but they were busy writing down what we must have throughout all eternity. When he brought Moshe forward then this priesthood then that he formed, the kingdom of heaven, they started writing the laws then for us. Before that, they had the laws, but they didn't have 10 commandments. Now, after the law, and you could see where it went. It wasn't taught, and the people couldn't grasp it. They were without a shepherd at that time. But now here again, see, Yahweh showed it again in 2,000 years time period. But now he had 10 commandments. And those 10 commandments I remember as a child. Anyone could read the scriptures, but the 10 commandments, even in the schools where I attended, in the country schools where I attended, the 10 commandments were talked about. But see, the 10 commandments is what saved, or what kept mankind from destroying himself and becoming like before the flood. And although they didn't hold on to the feast days and the Sabbath day, they did see the danger and understood, do not commit adultery. Well, it's adultery and fornication that's come forth since television time. In the last 50 years, when Yahweh said sin would increase, this is what Satan was attacking. When television come forth, she had her perfect tool to attack the 10 commandments. And there's where she started doing away and making adultery look great, fornication look great, and so forth. So there, she had her tool to work with to bring down this last tool that had kept the whole world for 2,000 years from being like it was before the flood. 10 commandments, and mainly the one, do not commit adultery.
Now, how do you uncover past climate? We have to rely on signatures of climate, fingerprints called proxies. That is something in the environment that's sensing what the past temperature or rainfall was like. You can look at bogs, for example. You can look at ice cores. You can look at tree growth. There's information there. These proxy experts can go in and look and reconstruct the past climate for that area. When a researcher had a record of past environment change, was there in that record a change that was very significant, very extreme?
Then when you're talking about the temperature change in the past 150 years...
There's one graph that comes out over and over, and that's the hockey stick graph.
Because it looks like a hockey stick, because it goes trundling along the bottom and then comes up.
If you look at the hockey stick...
The principal author of this new graph is Dr. Michael Mann. He says the graph is based on computer simulations of the temperature series of the last 140 years compared to old tree ring data.
A computer model is a very sophisticated computer program that attempts to simulate all of the processes associated with the atmosphere. In particular, therefore, what we need to have is as much data as possible to be able to fire the model, to be able to understand the processes.
Climate models can be thought of as a list of rules. And so this climate model, when it tries to predict the future, just follows specific rules. The real world is a physical system. It follows rules, but there are so many that are not contained in climate models.
Computer simulations are the tool that's used to make forecasts of temperature into the future.
The science in this case is indicating from incomplete models that we need to make political assertions and political changes. But part of the problem is that with incomplete science, we can make mistakes.
Climate observations are supposed to represent the truth, not the theory, against which our theory is to be checked. I believe observations, and that this is where our basis for climate change should be understood and the perspective from which we should see the future.
It's very difficult to figure that out by looking at climate simulations, computer simulations.
Their calibration actually is not that good.
A computer does only what it's programmed, and in particular, it is important, therefore, to program it correctly. The problem is we don't have perfect knowledge of how the Earth system operates. So therefore, we're working with an incomplete understanding base to try to put together what we know to see if it, in fact, generates the correct conditions.
The blue is cold and the red is warm. So if you look at 1,000 years worth of temperature and compare it to 1,000 years of CO2, you can see how closely they fit together.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok. And in the red, we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite.
This is the record of world temperature during the 20th century used by the IPCC. In the past 150 years, the temperature has risen just over ½ degree Celsius. But the strange thing is, most of that rise occurred in the early decades of the 20th century, between 1905 and 1940, when industrial production was still relatively small. After 1940, as industry expanded, for some reason the world cooled. This cooling is even more pronounced in other temperature reconstructions. This graph shows temperature change in the Arctic during the 20th century. Again, most of the rise occurs before 1940. And again, during the post-war economic boom, the temperature falls and continues falling for 35 years.
Up until about 1940, it's warming, unrelated to carbon dioxide. Then there's a cooling or a flattening of the temperature. That can't be, you can't be getting a cooling from increasing carbon dioxide. And then there's the warming at the end of the 20th century.
Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over ½ degree Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell.